Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, the one-eyed guy, I guess, right now. And we are here every Tuesday at 11 a.m. Pacific time, 2 p.m. Eastern time, with an hour in for Central and Mountain, to talk about military doctrine, military history, great military leaders, and how we can apply those lessons to bettering our businesses, helping them be more successful. So a couple of weeks ago, I started the sort of next section of Marine Corps warfighting doctrine, talking about cultural literacy and competence. And we're going to continue in that vein, dealing today with the subject of cultural differences. So I mean, it should be no surprise to anyone that the way people act, behave, think varies considerably from place to place. Even here within the United States, we have significant cultural differences between regions of the country, between people of either more recent immigration versus those whose families have been here for a longer time. All of these things create cultural differences, all the more so between two countries, and even between countries in the West. For example, there are cultural differences between Great Britain and the United States, between even France and Germany, although they're right next door. There are cultural differences between the U.S. And Mexico. Some are less than others. Nonetheless, it is a very valuable skill to develop to be able to negotiate these cultural differences. And so we're going to start talking about that today. Probably talk about it. We'll talk about it more in the coming weeks as well, and do rather a deep dive into this subject. So, going to go ahead and share screen as I do, and let's get the slideshow going. Here we go. Right, here's our military theme. I always joke about that. Okay, and the 3 pillars of attainment, okay, which is the basis for all the work we do here on the Way to Wow shows. Ostensibly, we're operating in the finances realm with the pursuits pillar, but we're also dealing in the relationships realm, and in particular, kind of friends and colleagues. Though that's part of dealing with cultural differences, and also our identity and our mindset. So, as I talked about a couple of weeks ago, part of being culturally literate is knowing who we are. Okay, having a thorough self-knowledge. Okay, and if you want to take a look at those past episodes, please go to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/@thewaytowow. You can check out those and all the other episodes. So knowing who we are makes it easier then to perceive cultural differences and respond to them in an appropriate fashion. And the desire to do that is a mindset. Okay, so some people have the mindset, they don't care about cultural differences. People have to conform to my way of doing and my way of thinking. Otherwise, they're not good people, or they're ignorant, or this or that or the other thing. Other people have a mindset more along the lines of, look, every culture has its distinctiveness, and it's incumbent upon me to understand those in order to be able to broaden the array of people with whom I can have a productive relationship. As you might guess, I consider myself to be, very much in the latter category. I do think that's an important skill for us to develop. So let's go on here. So in talking about cultural differences, culture is essentially defined through a series of cultural norms. Now, as we talk about cultural norms, right, for someone who has only been involved in his own culture, he probably doesn't look at these various aspects as norms per se. They're just the way things are, right? The person was raised that way, and they don't perceive any distinctiveness in them until they're confronted with someone who has different cultural norms. Okay, so the fact of the matter is, especially as children, we're all pretty much ethnocentric, meaning we look at our own culture as being the culture, in air quotes, right? And it's not until we see it in contrast to others that we begin to understand that, oh, every one of us is subject to certain cultural norms. Okay, but those norms are not universal throughout the world, or for that matter, even throughout the country or throughout, the state or even city that we live in. Okay, depending on where we are. Obviously, some places in the United States are more homogeneous than others. Okay, so we're going to talk about these various aspects of cultural norms. Okay, and that's going to give us that's going to give us a foundation from which to start examining how do we deal with cultural differences. So one of the questions you might be asking yourself right now is, well, wait a minute. I mean, there's so many different cultures. How do I know which cultures I want to learn to deal with? I mean, even like people tend to think of Asians as being, or even just Far East Asians as being, culturally homogenous. That's not true at all. Japanese culture is different than Chinese culture, which is different than Vietnamese culture, which is different than Thai culture, et cetera. And even within China or Japan, there are distinctive subcultures, if you will, right? So how many of them are we going to learn? Are we going to learn, 100 different cultures? No, that's actually not the goal. So while it might be desirable to learn the cultural norms and get comfortable with the cultural differences of a couple of key cultures, because a lot of your business is focused there. The idea is to set a framework in which we can quickly understand cultural differences when we need to deal with them, okay, and be more attuned to how we respond, okay, so that we don't make number one, cultural faux pas, but number two, we don't make assumptions about the people with whom we're dealing with from our cultural mindset, but rather, as much as possible, looking at their responses, et cetera, from their cultural mindset, right? Because that will give us greater insight into how to conduct our business. All right, so let's look at these. There's 7 cultural norms we're going to talk about. Okay? And the first one is thoughts, right? So just the way people think varies from culture to culture, okay? And thoughts and behavior, all of these things, are somewhat interactive. So it's difficult to just give an example of a cultural norm that's only thoughts oriented, because people are not separated that way. We're integrated, we're integrated beings. But in terms of thoughts, so some cultures really prioritize a much more linear way of thinking. Other cultures really develop a more sort of holistic way of thinking, or it maybe even almost like a circular way of thinking, okay? And so how a culture generally deals with its thoughts, the people within the culture, children they're just raised to think that way. There's no, it's not like there's, they're in school and they're okay, we're a linear thinking country, so you're going to learn to think linearly. No, that's not how it works. It's just, this is something, it's it's something that children almost absorb as opposed to learn, because they're in the gestalt of where they live. Okay. Next are behaviors. So the sets of actions, etc. Again, in our country, I'm going to give some examples of these after we go through the 7 cultural norms. But in our country, for example, upon meeting someone we don't know, or just meeting someone after not having seen them for a while, it's very customary to shake hands. And by the way, it used to be that only men shook hands, women did not. That was in the United States. That was in the 19th century. Generally speaking, men didn't shake hands with women. Nowadays, it's the cultural norm, especially in business, that men and women shake hands with each other. It's a way of greeting. In other cultures, the greeting is perhaps more formal, you might call it. So if as you've seen in certain Asian cultures, they bow. Okay. Now, in some of those cultures, they've adopted the handshake as a more informal greeting, but in a more formal situation, they will bow. In the United States, by the way, bowing used to be done. This is probably more toward or more in the sort of early to mid 19th century and earlier. A man would not shake hands with a woman, but when he was introduced, he would make a slight bow to her as a form of courtesy. Okay, bowing in the United States really doesn't exist anymore, at least among sort of normative American culture. But there are subcultures in the United States, I can imagine, among people who for whom bowing was a part of their is a part of their normal culture, where they continue to do so even though they're now living here in the United States. Okay. Patterns of communication. So these are the ways that we not just talk, but give even verbal clues about in order to send messages. Okay. And so here in the United States, we tend to sort of get right down to what it is we want to say. We're very sort of efficient, if you will, in the way we communicate. Okay, other cultures, they're less direct in how they approach verbal communication. In the United States, we tend not to be as broad in our body language. Our body language tends to be a little more subtle, whereas in other cultures, body language is larger. So if you've ever read any of Peter Mayle's books, he's the author of a very famous book called A Year in Provence. Peter Mayle was a Britisher who moved, he and his wife moved to the south of France, and he'll talk about people he meets, and he'll talk about how you'll meet a French woman in one of the markets, and she's carrying her 2 bags of food, and she'll meet a friend, and she will set down her bags in order that she can talk properly, because hand motions are a big part of communication in the south of France. Okay, I take Peter Mayle at his word. I have not been to the south of France. I don't know, but so that's an example though. Whereas here in the United States, for the most part, we're probably not going to set down our bundles if we meet a friend on the street and we're going to have a conversation with them. We're going to, hold our bags or whatever we've got and have the conversation, because arm movements are not as big a part of our patterns of communication. Okay, customs. How we just do things is obviously a big part of our cultural norms. So it used to be that the cultural norm the cultural norm I was brought up with was if a man, even a young man, or in my case a teenager, male, was with a woman, okay, and he was, they were driving in a car. So when the man, parked the car, first of all, the man would almost always drive. Like when I drove with my mother, I would usually end up driving, even though obviously she's older than me. Okay. So I would park the car, and then I was expected to come around and open the door for my mother, right? That was the custom back then. I remember one time, I don't remember where we drove, at the store somewhere, I think it was. And, my mother and I are talking. I pull in the parking space, I shut off the car, and I, get out of the car and close the door, and I'm walking off, and I'm still talking about whatever I'm talking to. And I get about 10, 15 feet away from the car, and I realize I'm talking to myself. And I go back to the car, and I open my mother's door, and I'm like, where were you? And she said, waiting for you to open the door. Right. That was her way of teaching her son that the appropriate thing is for you to come around and open my door. Now, she looked at that as a matter of respect. This is how a man showed respect for a woman, by opening the door for her. If we walked into a store, it was expected that I would hold the door open for my mother and let her through, but I wouldn't walk through first. Okay. And now, fast forward several years, I'm now in college. I'm out on a date with a woman, and we were going to a movie, and I'm driving the car, and I pull in the parking space, and I get out of the car, and I go walking around the back of the car to open the door for her, and I'm reaching for the door as she's opening it, and she looks at me and she says, "What, you think I can't open my own door?" I'm like, no, I'm quite sure you could open your own door. I was taught that the polite thing to do was for me to open the door for you out of respect for you. She says, "Yeah, don't do that." I'm like, oh, okay. So see, at that point, cultural norms were starting to change, and one might argue I was brought up with a kind of older or old-fashioned cultural norm, cultural custom, I should say, and they were changing. So these things can have some fluidity, by the way, even in what is otherwise seemingly a pretty homogeneous culture. Okay. So, but obviously customs make up a big part. And how do we learn them? We just learn the way, like the way I did. Parents, immerse their children in, this is how we do things, right? That's a custom. Okay. 3 more. Cultural norms, beliefs. Okay. So, again, and I'll just use, examples from the United States. So it used to be that there was a pretty broadly held belief that, the United States was a great country. It was a force for good in the world. All these kind of things. I would say that belief is less of a cultural norm today. And without getting into the politics of it, there's a significant number of Americans. I don't know that it's necessarily a majority, but it's certainly a significant number of Americans who believe that America is a malign force in the world. So, those kinds of belief, patriotism used to be a respected belief in the United States. Now, in many areas, I don't mean geographic areas necessarily, but in many areas of life, patriotism is considered déclassé. It's considered bad, even evil, right? So the beliefs that a culture generally has make up part of its cultural norms. Okay, as do its values. Okay, so in the United States, we value freedom. Now, I think it would be reasonable to say that there different groups in America might define freedom or liberty in different ways, but I do believe that that's a pretty universal value. If you ask the typical person walking, the typical person in the United States, do you value freedom? They would say yes. Okay. Now you might go on and say, what does freedom mean to you? And you might get different definitions. Okay. But that central value would be pretty universal here in the United States. Okay. As opposed to, do you believe in God? Right. So I remember when I first started in the Navy back in 2007, one of my colleagues showed me an article that had been published in the Washington Post that said that I think it was 92% of Americans said that they believe in God. Well, that's a pretty universal value at that point. I mean, I used to joke when I would do what's called the indoc brief, the indoctrination briefs. It was really the helping people who had newly come to Okinawa understand how things worked there. And I would joke with them, what other thing in American life do 92% of Americans agree on, right? So I would say that, I haven't seen any statistics more recently. So, that was already over 15 years ago, but I would bet that belief is not as broadly held today as it was 15 years ago. So that cultural norm the cultural norm of that value of believing in God, I think is probably changing. How rapidly, I can't say. All right, and then finally, institutions. So whether the institutions are private institutions like religious institutions, academic institutions, whether they're public institutions like governments, okay, how those work and the faith that people have in them are a cultural norm. So again, excuse me, church going or religious worship used to be a much more broadly held cultural norm. A belief in those institutions, reliance on those institutions was much more broadly held in the United States than they are today. So that's an institutional norm that has changed significantly over the last, say half century or more. Belief in the government too, or I should say maybe not belief in the government, faith in the government has also changed. Okay, so if you look at how many people, what percentage of people have faith in Congress, have faith in the presidency, in the Supreme Court, those have all dropped significantly too over the last 50 years. And there's a lot of expressions of lack of faith in our government institutions, really from many different political quarters. Our institutional, the cultural norms of our institutions are they're much less broad norms than they used to be. So those are changing. Now, I've spoken primarily about cultural norms within the United States as examples because those are the easiest ones, I think, for us to perceive in terms of the changes over time. But imagine, the differences in cultural norms in terms of beliefs and values between, say, the United States and China, or the United States and Saudi Arabia, even the United States and Mexico. So, probably bigger differences in cultural beliefs and values between Western countries and Asian and South Asian countries than third world countries, countries in Africa. Those are probably greater than, for example, the differences in cultural norms between the United States and Australia, where we have a fairly similar cultural heritage. We have, I think heritage is plural all by itself. So the cultural heritage of the United States and Australia are very similar, okay? And so that has led to much more similar cultural norms today than would be the case between, say, Vietnam and the United States, okay? Even though Vietnam, there was a significant French influence on Vietnam, and there's a French influence on the United States as well. Nonetheless, the major influence on Vietnam is a Southeast Asian influence, an Asian influence, whereas the biggest influences on the United States were Western European, okay? So as we continue with this subject of cultural differences and understanding cultural norms and how to deal with cultural differences, these are some of the aspects that I encourage you to keep in mind. And I just want to give you some ideas. This is coming right out of no, I don't know. I don't know why that came out. I'm going to stop sharing here. This is coming right out of Marine Corps warfighting doctrine. Okay, and there's some examples here that I think are worth considering as we talk about this. So we talk about dress and appearance, the cultural norms of dress and appearance, right? So the United States, and this is even more so post-COVID, right? We used to think of dressing for success in the United States. For men, it was to put on, a suit and tie, or at least a coat and tie. And for women, it was either an appropriate dress, or maybe a pantsuit, something that is dressy, if you will. Okay. Now, in the workplace, one can dress much more casually than ever before, and that's perfectly acceptable. Okay. And over the last century, especially, the ability to assess the wealth or cultural standing of someone in America based on their dress has significantly changed. These days, you can see someone in jeans and a t-shirt, and whereas 100 years ago, that person would have been a working class individual, and a wealthy upper class person would almost never dress that way, unless maybe they were going to, go fishing or something, and even then, probably not. Today, you have no idea of the wealth or class standing of an individual who's dressed in jeans and a t-shirt. You just don't. That's the casualness and flexibility of dress in the United States, whereas in other cultures, they retain a much more distinctive separation of how wealthier people or higher class people dress than less wealthy people, poor people, and people of a lower class would dress. Okay, so that's an example of a cultural norm that we can see pretty easily. Okay, food and eating habits, right? In the United States, for the most part, we eat in order to assuage our hunger and make sure we have energy for the day. Okay, whereas in other countries, eating is much more of a ritual all the time. Okay, so if you look at customs in France in how they eat, meals are a focus of the day. They are an opportunity for people to all meals, breakfast, lunch, dinner, all of them are opportunities for families to be together, for friends to be together, to converse, to share time together, etc. In this country, we do that sometimes, but breakfast, probably not anymore. I mean, it used to be families had breakfast together. You see it on TV shows from the 50s, perhaps, but not so much anymore in the United States. And even if you have a quote unquote breakfast meeting, the point of that meeting is to discuss business. Usually it's not to socialize per se. So maybe, you may have social lunches on occasion. You might have, dinners with friends, and those may be more similar to how people eat in France. But the whole cultural norms around eating in the United States, where there's a lot of focus on fast food, on quick serve, sit down restaurants, you have far less of that in France than you do here. And I see now we're at time, so there's some other so I do want to take time to do one more, and that is how relationships, especially family, friends. So in the United States, our relationships tend to revolve around the nuclear family. Now, that wasn't always the case. Extended kinship relationships were far more common 100 years ago and farther back today than they are now. And while there are people, and there are Americans who live in multi-generational households, that is not the norm in the United States. And generally, those people are, more recent arrivals to the United States. Okay, and that's as contrasted with say again, countries like China, where multi-generational households are far more common, and relationships are much more strongly based on kinship and family than they are here in the United States. While we think of our members of our family as being important, we have many other factors that enter into the quality of our relationships than just family and kinship. Okay, so the whole way that relationships are conducted in the United States is very, very different than it is in other countries, and that's one of the reasons why dealing with cross-cultural situations can be difficult. Is we're looking at relationships through our cultural norms and not realizing that the other people we're dealing with have different cultural norms in terms of how relationships are dealt with, and so we're operating at cross purposes. Okay, so that's what I've got for today on cultural differences. I hope that number one, you find this useful. I hope you find it interesting too. I think this is more and more important as things get more complex in the world, that we understand how to navigate cultural differences. And as the United States becomes more culturally diverse, I think it's also very important to understand how to navigate these differences successfully, because in the end, that is what's going to, I think, maintain societal, or it's one of the things that's going to maintain societal cohesion here in this country. So thank you very much for joining me today and hanging in for a few minutes longer than normal. I appreciate it very much. Tomorrow is tomorrow at 12:30 p.m. Pacific time is People Making Money, and the topic is the magic, I put that in air quotes, of compound interest. And as I mentioned in my show yesterday, we are going to be doing some, I'm not going to call it mathematics. I'm going to call it some money, because compound interest is a money concept, and money, in my experience, is always easier to figure out than math. And so I hope you will join me for that. It's a very, very useful tool to understand for your investment life, for the investment side of your life, I should say. And so that will be our topic for tomorrow. And then next week on Monday at 10 a.m. Pacific time will be the next edition of Trusts and Estates Weekly. And then 7 days from today, we will be back for the next edition of the Business Lessons from the Military. So thank you very, very much for joining me. Again, I hope you enjoyed it. Wishing you a wonderful and productive rest of the day. And signing off, Marie, darling, you are my belle. All the best, folks.